Hello there, and welcome to another edition of Catalysts, a platform for the scientific community to connect, discover, and transform. This is your host, Kedar Aras, and today it's my pleasure to connect with our next guest, Dr. Sarah Franklin, an assistant professor of internal medicine at University of Utah. Dr. Franklin's research focuses on understanding how the packaging of DNA and nucleosomes influences specific patterns of gene expression and how this packaging is modulated during disease to alter transcriptional activity. Specifically, her research lab is investigating the mechanistic basis for how remodeling of chromatin induces the re-expression of fetal genes in the heart during the development of hypertrophy and heart failure. Using a mouse model of pressure overloaded hypertrophy, a method for isolation and fractionation of cardiac nuclei, and the state of the art mass spectrometry, Dr. Franklin's team seeks to characterize the protein constituents of chromatin from normal and diseased hearts. Dr. Franklin, thank you for joining us on the Catalyst podcast. To begin with, can you share with us your experience as you transitioned from grad school into your postdoc career?
Sure. I did my graduate work at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. And when I was nearing the completion of my PhD, I was very interested in pursuing a postdoc.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very interested in going to academia. I had a little bit of a little thought in the back of my head, I think, about potentially industry. But I knew that academia was, that I would like it more.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like that's kind of where I wanted to be. I was kind of a little curious about industry. So I looked into postdoc opportunities in both academia and industry. And at the time, it seemed like many postdoc opportunities in industry were fairly competitive. I think because they paid more.
Mm-hmm.
I think also looking into them educated me a little bit more about them. And I didn't end up interviewing for any postdoc positions in industry, but I interviewed for several in academia, and I was very open at the time
Mm-hmm.
to geographically, I should say. So I wanted to stay in the U.S. I guess kind of if I were to rank my criteria, I would say I wanted to stay in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't care where it was in the U.S. that I wanted to go. But I also wanted to make a transition in my career at that time. So I'd been studying proteomics
Mm-hmm.
and mainly applying that to macular degeneration. So we've been studying the eye for several years.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wanted to switch to a field that I was a little more excited about. I was very interested in the eye, but I also wanted to feel like my research that I was doing was a little more impactful.
Mm-hmm.
And, I knew that the two number one and number two killers were heart disease, number one, and cancer, number two. And so I was targeted more to those fields, but also really wanted to, I developed a love for mass spectrometry and proteomics and really wanted to make sure that was a focus of my postdoc. So I interviewed several places at UCSF, at UCLA, back at the NIH, at Case Western, several places all across the US, and really was excited about a postdoc opportunity at UCLA. And so that's just kind of where it took me, where I went.
Got it. And did your advisor help you with the postdoc opportunities, or were you kind of doing it on your own?
For the most part, I was really doing it on my own.
Okay.
He was my advisor was very supportive
Mm-hmm.
at the time. Well, and is still. I continue to
Right.
email back and forth with him occasionally, but he was very supportive. But this was definitely something that I was in charge of, that I was driving.
Got it.
So, he obviously wrote letters of support or recommendation for me, and provided any input or answered any questions that I had, but it was really me kind of deciding where I wanted to go with my career from there.
Got it. And the postdoc interviewing typically, if I understand, is more similar to an assistant professor where you give a job talk and then have a lab visit and they ask you interview questions. Is it something similar across the board?
Yeah, so it's
Okay.
very similar. So most of the places that I went to, I would fly out there and stay usually just one night. And it kind of usually entailed 2 days or maybe a day and a half
Right.
of visiting the lab, visiting the professor and the individuals that worked in the lab. Usually maybe going out to lunch with the lab members to get to know them a little bit better, touring the facilities that they had there, whether that was part of an institute or part of a university, and giving a talk about my research, telling them what I'd been involved in and doing. So that's pretty much what it entailed, but it was also very interesting and informative to see other places, even if I didn't end up going there.
Right.
It was a very informative process.
Got it. And then you did your postdoc at UCLA. What attracted you to that position in that place in particular? Was it the advisor? Was it the research? Was it a combination or something?
It was definitely a combination. So I was very interested in the research. They were using animal models of disease, specifically mouse models of pressure overload hypertrophy and also myocardial infarction. And I had never used animal models before. So at BYU, we were using cells, isolated cells, cell culture, so cell models of disease for macular degeneration. We were also getting human tissue from the University of Utah. And those were the main model systems that we were using. And so I had never really been involved in animal research, especially whole animal research. And so that was something that was very interesting to me. I was also very impressed by the PI there. So Tom Bondriskus, who I did my postdoc with, and he was, I was impressed with him. I was impressed with his lab, the research that he was doing. And it was really kind of the whole package, the whole combination that really attracted me there.
Got it. And now during your postdoc, I imagine it was a 2-year contract, or was it 4 years, or?
Going into it, there wasn't a specific time limit set.
Okay.
I think it's becoming much more common to do longer postdocs nowadays. And also it's become more common to do multiple postdocs. I think that some people very frequently do 2 postdocs.
Got it.
So I was there for 5 years as a postdoc. Then I transitioned to an adjunct assistant professor for 1 year before I came to the University of Utah.
Got it. And during your 5 years as a postdoc, did you spend time, how much time did your postdoc PI help you in terms of building your future research portfolio? And how much time did you spend actually working on the research that the postdoc PI was interested in? And was that something that you negotiated beforehand, or was it something that just happened organically?
Sure. So Tom was very supportive, and he is now as well. And he's an incredible mentor. He was very supportive of me developing my own research path. Definitely in the first couple of years, the focus was really getting familiar with this new field I transitioned into, getting familiar with UCLA, the research they were doing there. And, he was very supportive all along the way as far as career development goes.
Right.
So I was very involved in the research in his lab, and he was very supportive early on of me coming up with my own ideas and telling me, that I needed to develop research that would be my own and that would be something that I could build upon. And as part of that, we developed a project, a proteomics project, that we generated a lot of data for. We were very interested in quantifying the proteins that bound to chromatin in the nucleus of cardiac cells. And by doing that, we could really understand the proteins that were driving chromatin remodeling and gene expression
right.
during or in the normal heart as well as during
hypertrophy and heart failure.
Exactly. So in this process, we generated kind of enough data that we could fuel our careers, both of our careers, kind of for the next several years.
Right.
And so from that, I kind of took a part of that project and really built upon it. And he was very supportive all along the way. It wasn't something we necessarily, I can't remember how you phrased it. It wasn't something we negotiated on initially, but he was just very supportive. And there were times where we would sit down and specifically talk about what avenues I was pursuing and other projects, that he had ongoing in his lab. And I feel like he was probably the most crucial point or most crucial person in my career development throughout my entire career. He really was supportive. So I guess as you asked as far as time management, I definitely did spend the majority of my time on the research aspect. And then career development as far as going to conferences, presenting my research in talk or poster format, kind of organically came out of that. As long as the research was progressing and we were generating great data, presenting that data, and some of the career development aspects that flowed from that were just really natural.
Got it. So then you mentioned how from postdoc you had a 1-year adjunct position before you transitioned into assistant professorship at University of Utah. Can you kind of elaborate more on how the transition happened?
Sure. So after I'd been there a couple of years, I was interested in applying for a K99 R00 award as a fellow to faculty kind of transition award. And Tom was very supportive of that. And so I submitted the K99 and it was funded. And kind of as part of receiving that grant, I was promoted, I guess you'd say, to an adjunct assistant professor. Still working in Tom's lab, but I had a lot of autonomy as far as doing research and pushing that research forward. So that was about the last year that I was there at UCLA.
Got it. And then how did the whole process of interviewing for assistant professorship happen? I mean, I imagine you probably interviewed at multiple universities outside of University of Utah, or was it just one end?
Yeah, so that was a very different time in my life.
Okay.
And initially when I was searching for a postdoc, I was not geographically limited at all. I'd gotten married as a postdoc, and I got married to my husband who lived in Utah. So we spent the last couple of years apart. I would fly very frequently to Utah to visit him. He has 2 kids that live here in Utah, and so that's really what kept him in Utah. And so I was tempted to look at job positions at other universities, and did a little bit, but really, we kind of toyed with the idea of potentially going somewhere else, somewhere close, still close to Utah, where, but I think really in the end, you have to have work-life balance. And my decision to come to the University of Utah was primarily driven by that, to have the balance.
Work and life balance.
Yep, exactly. And, he was here, and in the end, that's just what it came down to, is that I wanted to be where he was, and he needed to be where his kids were to be a wonderful dad. And that's really what drove the decision. So, and the thing is that I was lucky that there's a great university here in Utah where he was at. And so I've never regretted the decision. I've been incredibly happy with coming here and the people here, people to collaborate with, and the environment. So it wasn't as broad of a search. Some people are not as geographically limited as I was during that transition in my life.
Right.
And I think that for a lot of people, you have to know yourself, and you have to know what's best for you. You really have to know if making a career choice is going to overall make you a happy person and a successful person. And sometimes there's a lot of factors that play into that, not just the career ones, I guess. If there's family or other things that influence your life, I think those have to be a necessary aspect of the decision-making process.
Absolutely, and then that's a great point. I mean, you gotta be focused on your career, but you also have to manage and balance your work and personal lives in order to have a rich life.
Exactly.
Can you kind of walk us through the interviewing process with the University of Utah? Did you already know of a position that was available that you applied to, or did somebody reach out to you and say, you look like a good candidate, why don't you come interview with us?
Yeah, there wasn't actually a position that they were advertising at the time. I knew I wanted to come to the University of Utah, and I knew a couple of individuals in the Hartfield. So at the time, Del Abel and Ivor Benjamin were here at the University of Utah, and I had known them, just met them at conferences, or they knew my PI. And I really had to be very proactive because, like I said, there wasn't just a job posting, but I wanted to come here. And so I contacted several individuals here. I'd also been collaborating with an individual who was here at the University of Utah. Her name was Ann Moon, and she'd been sending samples for us to analyze by mass spectrometry for probably 6 months, I think, prior to that. And so she was very supportive as well, and talked to a few people on campus. And so kind of through those dialogues, I started to talk to people who were interested in having me meet with them or interview with them. And obviously the critical conversation was with Ken Spitzer here at the Institute. And the first time I met with him was just one of my weekend trips out to visit Jason and his kids. And I think I stayed late until a Monday, met with Ken that morning, and just spoke with him about any possibilities that they may have. And he was impressed, and spoke with the other co-directors here, as well as I think the Treadwell board, about the possibility of hiring me. And so they'd actually been interested in looking for somebody to join the Institute, but hadn't had an official post out. And so it was kind of two perfect scenarios. Yep. Yeah, exactly. So they were actually wanting to hire someone, just didn't have a post out, and I was wanting to come here. And so I still went through a normal interview process. Right. And it actually took about a year, 12 months from the first time I met with Ken until I actually started here.
Wow.
So it did, and I think most academic interviews for an assistant professor position, that's probably typical. So it does take longer. You want to plan a little bit longer for that transition. But I also had a few kind of funny things happen during that time period. So I was originally going to be hired through the physiology department here on campus, and had started interviewing with them and CVRTI at the same time. During that process, though, the university decided that they were going to dissolve the physiology department. And so once they'd started the paperwork, the university said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we're actually not interested in letting you hire anybody because we're planning on dissolving this department." And so we kind of had to start the paperwork over through the cardiology department. So I think that's one aspect that contributed to being a little bit longer. But I think probably 8 months is pretty typical for an assistant professor position from kind of interviewing to actually starting. So it wasn't too much longer than normal.
Got it. And then the way I understand it is during that whole transitioning from postdoc to assistant professor, the interview process involves a job talk and a chalk talk. Did you have to go through that, and can you kind of share with us some insights you gained along the way?
And I think the way that you described it is a pretty typical interview process. Mine involved some of those aspects. I I think I did 3 what you would refer to as job talks.
Okay.
So I came and I did a talk for the physiology department, and then I did a talk for CVRTI faculty on a different date. And then there were some individuals in the physiology department that had missed my original talk. And so I came back, the chair of the department at the time was very interested in making sure all of the faculty met me and knew what I was doing and had a kind of a say in how the department would be changing. And so I came back and gave a second talk to the physiology department. And then we ran into the transition where I needed to be hired through the cardiology department. So I didn't actually do what's referred to as a chalk talk. Mm-hmm. That was actually never part of my interview process, but I did do 3 job talks. So that's probably a little bit different.
Got it.
But it was very good and informative to meet everybody in CVRTI and the physiology department, as well as some people in the cardiology department during that process, and let them know what I was doing and was planning on doing as well in the future with the research in my lab.
Got it. And in your job talk, I imagine your presentation primarily focused on the work you had done in the postdoc, during your postdoc. And how much was it that time period that you had a well-rounded view of what you wanted your research portfolio to look like, in terms of this is what I want to do if I come here, and this is how it's gonna be in the next 3 to 5 years? So did you have that plan that you were able to present during your job talk, or was it still a little in flux?
So I had, at the time, I'd been awarded the K99 award, and as part of that, there's 2 parts to the grant. It's a little bit different because the K99 phase is 2 years, which is considered kind of the end or wrap up of your postdoc, and then 3 years of an assistant professor position. So it funds in total 5 years. And when you write the application, you are writing a 5-year grant. So I had been awarded that, and so I'd already really taken a lot of time to think about where I wanted my research to go. And so when I presented those job talks, I did spend quite a bit of time on my postdoc research, what I had been involved in the years previous, but also it was nice because I felt like I was a little extra prepared for describing to them the research that I wanted to be doing in my lab moving forward, and exactly kind of how that transition would occur. So because those experiments hadn't occurred yet,
right.
There was less of my, or a smaller portion of my talk that was dedicated to the slides describing that, but that was included in all of my job talks.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So knowing that not many people end up winning a K99, but you did, what does it take to have a successful K9 application? I imagine you have to have a strong publication history, but in addition to that, what kind of does it entail to kind of, in your opinion, a successful K99 grant?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that K99 awards, I think, have changed a little bit. Okay. I think they're only 4 years now, and they have a little more restrictions as far as how long you can be a postdoc. I think probably one of the best things that you can do as a trainee is to make sure you are aware of the funding opportunities that you qualify for. Whether those are things you qualify for now or will qualify for in a year or 2 years or 3 years, because it helps you plan for your future as well. And we all know that funding is a critical aspect of that. So for my K99, trying to remember your questions you asked me because I went off on a little tangent there. You asked me
about how what does it take to have a successful K99?
Yeah, so to have a successful K99 application, I think it's critical, like you said, to have a good track record of publishing, but you also need to have some good ideas as well. And as part of those research ideas, you need to be able to clearly show that you have a unique research direction that you're going to pursue that's different from your current PI, and that will lead to or be a project that you can incorporate into the research that you will have in your lab moving forward. So this is something that's going to have kind of clear-cut boundaries between your current PI and what you will be doing moving forward. I think it's very good to try and incorporate methods or techniques or ideas that will open up new avenues or pathways for you to develop. Sometimes that can be difficult for people to separate the research that they're doing or make clear boundaries from their PI's research and what they want to do moving forward. But I think if you have a good mentor, a good PI, they'll recognize that and they will help you and encourage you to really develop your own research direction.
Got it.
I think it's critical to try and identify a mentor who's going to be supportive of you moving forward and supportive of you kind of developing your own research direction. And those things need to all be balanced out by the research that you're doing in your postdoc lab, as well as other priorities at the time. But I think communication is one of the best ways to manage that.
Got it.
Trying to think of other successful parts to a K99 application. They also have other transition awards, not just the K99 out there. I know the American Heart Association now has a Fellow to Faculty Transition Award, and there's some other ones out there that I think it's becoming increasingly clear that this is a critical point, a critical transition point in someone's career, and that by offering these types of funding opportunities, it can really help with that transition and make it a lot smoother. So, I would look for those regardless of what field you're in. There can be field-specific ones, like I mentioned, the American Heart Association. I'm sure there are similar ones for other research fields. But I think those are some of the keys, at least, to a good application.
Okay. Now, switching tracks a little bit. Once you got accepted into as an assistant professor, did you have to negotiate what you needed in terms of the salary negotiations, or what it takes to establish a lab in terms of equipment and resources and stuff like that up front? Or was that part of a package deal where they offered you a set amount and said, okay, you have this money to work with, study your lab, or something like that? How does that process work?
Yeah, so I think in most situations it's very common to be a negotiation process between what the resources the department has and what you need to set up a lab. And I think some of that comes out during the interview process. So if if you need a lot of resources and the department doesn't have those, they may decide that you're not a good fit as far as a candidate for them. But that is definitely part of the interview process. But as far as being offered a position, usually that comes with very clear delineations as far as funding and space and what they are able to offer you. And I think it's expected in every situation that there will be some negotiation there, including regarding your salary and things like that. And I think it's very important that when you start up your lab that you don't be shy. You ask for what you need. Right. And don't be worried about asking for things or negotiating. I think some people worry about that process, but I think it is part of the process.
Got it. And I imagine you had certain expectations of what it would take to establish your own lab, and then you established your own lab. Looking back, were there things you did not anticipate when you were deciding to establish your own lab and actually doing it? Were there some things you figured, I didn't know this is what it takes, and some of the insights perhaps you could share with us?
Sure. So probably the 2 years leading up to my transition to assistant professor, I was very active in speaking with other people who had also gone through that transition very recently. And I wanted to pick their brains. I wanted to ask them the same question you asked me.
Right.
What to expect, what was their surprises. And I think that in me doing that, me being proactive about it, I didn't have surprises. I think I was able to get a lot of really good advice from other people regarding that transition. And I think, even prior to that, so during graduate school, I was the president of the Graduate Student Association at BYU, and then was the president of the Postdoc Association at UCLA for a year or two. I'm starting to forget if it was a year or two. But actively involved in the organization most of the time I was there. And one of the things that both of these organizations did at those institutes was they tried to educate grad students and postdocs about those transitions, as well as educate them about all different types of job opportunities. So jobs within academia, jobs within industry, jobs you've never thought of before. And I think as part of that process, we also put on, workshops to inform people how to write grants, how to be prepared for that transition. And I learned a lot being involved in those organizations. And I think that those things really benefited me. I don't feel like I had any surprises as part of my transition. I think, I'm trying to think if there were any surprises. Like, I can't think of any surprises, but I don't think there were any real surprises as part of that transition. We had an issue with our cooling in one of our rooms when we installed our mass spec. That was really, I think, case dependent. So you probably run into things like that. But regarding the transition, really, I think I was very well educated. And I think most people if they can be very educated about that process, specifically if they put the time and energy into talking to other people, just, like you are, and filling different people out for, like you said, what if there were any surprises for them, or what were the big lessons they learned from going through that process. And I think I really was just able to take advantage of a lot of other people's great advice.
Got it. Okay. Now, having been here 2 years or?
Yeah, 2.5 years.
2.5 years. When it comes to expanding your research portfolio, the question that comes to mind is, how do you come up with new ideas to do research, to kind of build on your portfolio? Is it mostly based on organic research, wherein the data you collect from your research spurs new ideas? Or does it come through collaboration, meeting people at different conferences and kind of doing a brain melding, or something adjacency, something totally unrelated to your field that creates a new spotlight on an area? Or is it a combination? And how much time do you spend kind of seeking out new ideas?
I think, at least for me, it's been a combination of things. So I think sometimes new ideas or new directions do come from collaborative projects, or with meeting someone new that comes to campus, and realizing and talking with them that some things that we do and some things that they do can be merged to create this really exciting project. So definitely some of the things that we've done or expanded on have been directly from collaborative projects. Some of the other things that we've been doing in the lab, as far as kind of new research directions, come from generating very unexpected data. So sometimes you have a hypothesis and you do experiments to test that, and you get a very different result than you're expecting. And sometimes those can be very disappointing, and sometimes they can be very exciting. And those exciting ones can often lead to new areas of research. And so I think that keeping your mind open and not being kind of closed-minded to different areas can be very exciting and good, because it may take you in directions you never thought of before, but also be very exciting directions in the end. So I think it's really kind of a combination between the two. I think everybody's a little bit different in their creativity. I know when I go to conferences, there's a lot of opportunities to spur ideas with me, and I think that oftentimes that I come back from conferences with new ideas. but that can also happen just in the lab as well. So it's a little bit of a balance between both of those.
And then you mentioned how sometimes experiments yield disappointing results, and that can be a little challenging to deal with disappointments. How do you deal with disappointments? Because if you're doing research, you're bound to experience failures, so that's part of the process. But that doesn't make it any easier. How do you kind of deal with it and kind of move forward? What's your process like?
Absolutely. You, as a scientist, I think we normally deal with failure and disappointment on a daily basis. But accepting that that is part of the process can be one of those first steps to deal with challenges. I think that challenges can be really good in our lives as well. A lot of people look at them, failures or challenges or disappointments, as negative things. And if we can look at them in a different light and recognize that sometimes every failure has an opportunity to teach you something. If you do an experiment and it doesn't work, then you can try it in a different way and it may still not work. But every time that fails, it's teaching you something about your system. It's teaching you something about your experiments. And if you can focus on those things, those will, those ideas and those things that you're learning can, I think, launch your experiments and help you in the end develop maybe an even better experiment, or help you eventually get a result that's better than what you could have even thought of. And I think focusing on what you're learning along the way, focusing on what does go right, helps you overcome some of those challenges.
Got it. And when it comes to grant writing, how much time do you spend writing grants, securing funding, and how much time does it take away from doing actual research?
Grant writing is a big part of being a PI in academia, whether it's grants that I'm writing or fellowships that postdocs or grad students are applying for in my lab. It all takes up time, and it is definitely a big portion of it. I know some people don't enjoy writing, and I don't think that I would have to say that's probably one of the things I think I struggle with the most, but I try to enjoy it. I think I have to plan a little bit longer for an application just because I do take longer to write. But I think, regardless of who you are and how well you write, the writing process can be an extremely beneficial process. It really can help you solidify your ideas. It helps you think through experiments before you attempt to do them. And in that process, it helps you to whittle out the things that, whittle out maybe experiments that are less important, helps you to focus on the more important experiments, as well as think through appropriate controls, and also make sure that you have a big picture idea in mind, as well as all those little details that you need that are crucial for your experiments as well. So I think that regardless of how much you enjoy writing or don't enjoy writing, if you can learn to enjoy it, I think it can be a very beneficial process. It does take a lot of time, like I said, whether it's larger grants that the lab's applying for, or just individual fellowships that people in my lab are putting together. It all does take up time, but there can be good and beneficial aspects to all the areas that we talked about: grant writing, writing papers, writing abstracts, all the different parts of writing that you encounter in the sciences. Really can, I think, benefit your program if you kind of have the right attitude.
Got it. So grant writing is a necessary part of the process. So enjoy it, and the more you work at it, the easier it gets, I imagine.
Exactly, yes.
Okay. Speaking of postdocs, I imagine you have postdocs in your lab as well as grad students. Is there a particular kind of trait you look for when you're looking to hire postdocs or grad students? What kind of things or skills you look for when you're trying to hire the right people to work in your lab?
I think one of the, or a few of the most important characteristics are having a love for science, really having a love and a desire to learn, and getting excited about being in the lab, getting excited about the experiments you're doing. I think you really have to have a passion for it. I think the most successful people are passionate about it. A few other things that I look for are people that are willing to work hard. And I think some of these traits or characteristics can help you be successful regardless of what area you go into in your life. But you do encounter a lot of failure in the lab, and being able to recognize that that's just a part of science and still maintain a positive attitude and have that passion and drive and love for what you're doing and what you're learning, I think is really important.
Got it. And looking back, I mean, you did your PhD, you did your postdoc, and now you're here. And it's still early in your career, but looking back, do you wish you had done more of something or less of something in order to, I don't know, be in a better position, or maybe not? I don't know. Just
sure. I'm not necessarily the type of person to dwell on the past. So usually I don't inherently have regrets in my life, just because I typically like to think of, that was a part of my life. And, everybody makes mistakes throughout parts of their lives, and those mistakes, they teach you and they help you grow. And to be honest with you, I really think in my career I've been incredibly fortunate. I've had fantastic mentors, even from the time I was an undergrad, and mentors that really influenced me and supported me throughout my career development, people that I'm incredibly grateful for. I can't think of anything I would go back and change, necessarily. I really, like I said, I think I've been very fortunate in my career and had very supportive people, even my family and friends who all supported me in their own little ways. And, every once in a while I think, maybe I was a little bit on the fast track in undergrad and in my undergraduate career. And every once in a while I think, maybe I should have taken a few more electives, or, maybe I should have taken more biology classes. My graduate program was very chemistry heavy, but, at the same time, I may think every once in a while that those are things that I might like to incorporate, but at the same time, I really wouldn't want to change the path I've been on. It's been a fun adventure, and, who knows if I really would have enjoyed those extra electives if I would have taken more as an undergrad. So,
got it. The second to last question to this podcast. Your focus of your research lab is epigenetic expression of regulation of gene expression. How do you see this field evolving in the next 5 years or 7 years? What are some of the challenges and what are some of the exciting things that are coming down the pipe from your point of view?
I think that, epigenetics in general, I think is very exciting right now. It's now that we've sequenced the human genome and we understand the underlying genetics, we're definitely understanding that or realizing that we know very little about the system. And that's one of those interesting things about knowledge, is that often when you learn more, you realize how little you know. And as far as epigenetics go, it's an exciting time. I think it's a relatively new field where there's a lot of unknowns. And I think moving forward, understanding histone post-translational modifications and how they work in concert, how they work together to provide a transcriptional output will be very interesting. I think really up until this time, we've been very limited by some techniques that only allow us to look at individual post-translational modifications. So one at a time, or maybe two at a time. But as we start to understand how combinations of these kind of play together, we'll really start to understand how complex transcription can be, right, or repression at the same time. I think we'll also just really hitting the tip of the iceberg as far as understanding the enzymes that regulate chromatin structure, histomethyltransferases, and even regarding other post-translational modifications, we've been very focused on methylation and acetylation, and there are a number of other post-translational modifications that we're starting to become more aware of on chromatin. And so as we do that, we also become more aware of the enzymes that regulate those, and really understanding how these proteins and post-translational modifications work together and how they're misregulated during disease can be one of the most interesting questions. And I think that will be really interesting to see as we move forward and we begin to understand these molecules better, how we can then potentially target them for various therapeutics.
Got it. And the last question before we end this podcast, 25, 30 years from now, when you have accomplished everything you want to, and you look back in your career, what would you like your legacy to be? How would you like to be remembered as by your peers, by your students?
I think I've mentioned or alluded to a couple of times in the podcast already is that I have benefited so much in my career from fantastic mentors. Even from the time I was, an undergrad and before then, people that have been critical in my life in supporting me. And I know one of the things that is something that I always strive to do, support the people in my lab, support them in their careers, support them in their research. And I hope that, I hope really my biggest hope is that the people in my lab will go on to be very successful and happy, regardless of what path they choose, if they want to stay in industry or academia or go on to some very different field. I want them to be successful, and I hope that that I'm able to support them and help them as much as I can in their career development.
Great. Well, Dr. Franklin, thank you for taking the time to join with us. And with that, we'll end this podcast episode.
Thank you very much.
If you liked what you have heard, I encourage you to share this episode with a friend. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on how you are striving to be a catalyst. So I invite you to leave a comment on the Catalyst's website. Thank you for listening, and until next time, connect, discover,